Well, thank you, Leslie, and all three professors for that illuminating discussion. Next up, we have our cultivated meat focused panel themed Where's the Beef? How cultivated meat will make its way to your plate. Well, this is certainly a very timely discussion, considering just earlier this week, Nestle, the world's largest food company, announced that it would be working on cultivated meat together with Future Meat. So I'll leave it to our panelists, Prof. Yaakov Nahmias, who is the founder and CSO of Future Meat Technologies, to tell us more about this particular development. Prof. Yaakov is a bioengineer and innovator whose breakthroughs range from the first 3D printing of cells to the first commercial human on chip technology. He is the founding director of the Grass Center for Bioengineering at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. We're also excited to have on this panel Maarten Bosch, CEO of Mosa Meat, the pioneer in cultivated meat, which in 2013 unveiled the world's first cultivated beef burger. Now, that first burger cost 250,000 euros, but Mosa Meat has since come a long way, and Maarten has brought his expertise from working in different consumer industries to take Mosa to the next level. Bringing in a wider perspective from the meat industry, we have Rahul Ray, Senior Director of Tyson Ventures, the investment arm of Tyson Foods. Focused on deal flow and investment execution, Rahul has more than a decade of experience in corporate finance and brings a deep knowledge of investment strategy and management to Tyson Ventures, which has made over $40 million worth of investments in the last 5 years. Moderating this panel is Louisa Burwood-Taylor, Head of Media and Research for Agfunder and Chief Editor of its news site AFN. With 12 years of financial journalism experience, Louisa has covered a range of financial products and markets during her career before turning her attention to food and agriculture over 7 years ago. Now, if you have any questions for our panel, please pop them in the box to the right of this video stream. Over to you, Louisa.
Thank you so much to Jinyi and everyone at Pinduoduo for inviting me to speak about cultivated meat. This is a topic of the moment. It's super exciting. I've certainly been tracking this for about 5 years now, and there's plenty of you on the panel that'll be looking at this for much longer, but it's a very exciting time for cultivated meat because last November we had the first cultivated meat product was approved and sold to consumers in Singapore with Eat Just, and it looks like we're just around the corner for having more products on the market. So it's very, very exciting. And actually yesterday even there was news that the French government had invested in a cultivated meat company that's producing foie gras without the use of animals. But what exactly is cultivated meat? So I'd like to kick things off by asking you all on the panel, what is cultivated meat? What can you tell us about how different companies are approaching this and how they differentiate themselves? I'm sure you won't be able to share too much of your secret sauce, but Maarten, maybe you can kick things off and explain a bit about the process that you use at Mosa Meat.
Sure, Louisa, thanks a lot, and hi everyone, and thanks to Pinduoduo for having me on this panel. Exciting to talk about this topic with all of you. What is cultivated meat? It is basically creating meat without having to raise and kill animals while doing so. Your question is, what are the different technologies out there, and what are the different companies using? Maybe I can best start by explaining what we do at Mosa Meat. What we do is we focus on beef. So we take a sample with cells from a living animal through a biopsy from a living cow. From this biopsy, we isolate the cells that we want to work with. These are adult stem cells. And we take these cells and we basically put them in a vessel called a cultivator, where we stimulate them by feeding them certain nutrients. They're basically placed in a broth, which is our secret sauce. And by putting them in that broth, we kind of trick the cells into thinking that they're still inside the animal, and therefore they start to perform their natural behavior. And in this first part of the process, that is that they will start to duplicate. So one cell becomes two cells, et cetera, et cetera. It's an exponential process. So after a few weeks, you end up with billions and billions of cells. Then the next step of the process is basically that we change the broth, change the nutrients that surround the cells, and we stimulate them in a different way. into another form of natural behavior, and that is to form tissue. In this phase, we either form muscle tissue or cell tissue. And after a couple of weeks, the tissue is formed, and this is where real meat is created. Real meat, meaning a tissue with the texture, the taste, and a nutritional profile that is equal to meat as we know it, coming directly from cows. After this process, which takes about roughly 2 months in total, we end up with quite an amount currently of in our case, minced beef. We can mix the fat and the muscle tissue in a ratio that the customer wants, and then we have minced beef. Now, one biopsy yields about 80,000 up to 80,000 hamburgers, and that is pure meat. If you put it under a microscope, it's the same. We produce it without any genetic modification, and that is basically what we do at Mosa Meat. So that is an answer to your question. And also, what do other companies do? Maybe, I don't know if Yaakov wants to respond, but I know that there are different approaches, different types of species. So there's plenty of variation out there, but I think the starting principle of replacing, meat that comes from animals directly, and which has a lot of negative externalities, is the thing that unites us all.
Absolutely, yes. Yaakov, what can you tell us about how your process is differentiated?
So our process is very different. I think that we need to start at the beginning. Why would we even go there? There are companies that are producing plant-based meat. So what's the problem with plant-based meat? Why can't we get what we want by using soy or peas or, any other protein, tofu, for example? And the reason is that, well, my kids don't like it. This is the beginning and the end of it. It has the right texture of meat. Most of the plant-based ingredients can give you the fibers, can give you the bite, but they don't smell like meat. They don't cook like meat, and they don't taste exactly like meat. So if it's a burger in a bun with cheese on top and a lot of ketchup, it's fine. But for most of the other applications, then there is something missing. And what is missing is the aroma of meat. What we're missing is the flavor of meat. And this is something that we are all ingrained. We are born with this sense. We can smell meat from 500 meters away. For the American of us, it's 500 yards away. Rahul, I have you. So we are very sensitive to it, and the reason we can smell it is because the fat in the meat oxidizes and gives us hundreds of polar aromatic hydrocarbons that we simply can't make in the plant kingdom. And people are really addicted to this. We crave it to the point where if you go vegan, you really have to work very, very hard on yourself to stop craving meat. And this is something that cultured meat can actually bring to the table. We don't have to get that meat from animals. We can grow it in bioreactors today. Exactly what Maarten says. We can grow the cultured fat, we can grow the cultured muscle, we can make the same aromatic compounds. We can, and we can do that without harming animals, without laying waste to the environment. We can do it in a much more sterile environment that doesn't have the microbiome that is associated with Salmonella or E. coli, for example. And this is critical. Now, different companies are doing it in different ways. The way Future Meat Technologies is doing that is by immortalizing the cells. Essentially, we take a biopsy only once, and the cells we produce from these biopsies don't make 8,000 burgers or 80,000 burgers or 800,000 burgers. They make an infinite amount of burgers. The cells are essentially immortal. And we chose cells that can go this process of immortalization spontaneously. That means we are not doing any genetic modifications to the cells. So the product that we have is uniquely non-GMO. Other companies are using genetic modification and then immortalizing the cells, and this is different from different companies. So this is really what makes us unique in future meat technologies.
Great, thank you. And Rahul, you're an investor in Future Meat, what Tyson Ventures is, but I presume you looked at a few different companies in the space. You know, what sort of stood out to you about them versus some of the others?
Yeah, and just a minute ago, just listening to Kobe, and just for as a footnote, Kobe equals Professor Yaakov. I'm just going to say Kobe, so you guys know who I'm referring to. But you kind of heard the way he described the problem. That's what was really attractive to us about Future Meat, right? This is, when you think about the space, right, you have to separate the mission statement from the technology, right? Because I think the mission statement, and there's so many companies, I think on last count is like more than 60 plus startups in the space, right? So in some ways, what I would consider the Fred in the shed, a couple of scientists in the lab sort of taking some meat and growing it, that problem has been done. It's been done by many startups. But the real challenge of how do you get a product to scale sort of at the right price, the taste, and just listening to how Kobe thinks through the problem was interesting to us. Like, he's solving the engineering problem. And as an engineer myself, I can appreciate that versus, you know, just the mission statement. And that's really what got us interested in Future Meat and the work that Kobe's doing.
Great, thank you. So, you know, there's obviously challenges around regulators and getting approvals. There's always been question marks around the growth factors. So it seems like there's quite a bit of developments on that front. But, you know, I'm keen to understand what other challenges remain to get products ready for market. You know, what is the biggest challenge? There's often been a talk about cost, and Jinyi mentioned, you know, that the first cultivated burger was hundreds of thousands of euros in price. So where are we in terms of cost, and what are the other challenges that remain before your two companies will see products on the market? Let's start with you, Maarten.
Yeah, no, there are plenty of challenges ahead. I think two of the main challenges were already sort of mentioned. It's scaling up our technology, and that's not only, you know, getting our own technology to sizes that can be rolled out industrially, but it's setting up the whole ecosystem, making sure that the nutrients that our cells need in order to grow are available at at scale in different parts of the world at the right prices, and that's one element. So scaling up the technologies is, I think, really what we're working on a day-to-day basis, on really getting down the cost to be not only competitive to conventional meat, but, you know, as we are more efficient than a cow in converting nutrients, we can become cheaper if we are really at scale. I think the other challenge, which is a very practical one, is regulatory approval. I think it's a topic that's been discussed in, I think, also during this convention. There are different governments in the world that are trying to figure out how to approve this novel type of food. It was a great milestone, as was indicated in the introduction, that late last year, the first cultured meat product was approved in Singapore, a chicken nugget. I think that proves that, you know, governments are taking this serious, that there is, you know, a path to a market. And I think there are other parts of the world that hopefully will follow soon. Not every government has figured out their approach yet. Luckily, some governments have figured it out. And for us, it's a matter of how quickly can we get this regulatory approval in place in order for us to start selling our product and to start making an impact. And I think that's the big question.
Yaakov, why was Eat Just the first company to sell a cultivated meat product on the market?
Yeah, so it's, at the end of the day, it's all about the price. So if you're willing to invest, you know, tens of millions of dollars of getting a product to the market first, then that's fine. The question is, you know, is there a real value in a $4,000 hamburger? And I think There is, it just made a landmark decision to invest all that money to get people to experience it first, to get the first regulatory agents to approve it, and really get things going and get everybody interested in this. I think you'll see a lot more VCs, a lot more countries, a lot more regulatory agencies, taking this seriously. We definitely felt it in Israel, in the United States, and all across Europe. Now, the real challenge, though, is not getting cells to grow in serum and in large scale that we've been doing for the past 2.5 years. The real challenge was to get the cells to grow in serum-free medium, essentially animal component-free medium, which is much more demanding because you have to get all of the ingredients exactly correct, and you have to remove critical serum proteins and growth factors that you alluded to. This is something that we managed to do for multiple species since 2019. And really, Future Meat Technologies just announced the first cultured meat production line at scale. So we are just below 1,000 liter scale at a production line that can make about 500 kilograms a day at full peak capacity. So this is a critical scale up and demonstration of the technology of cultured meat that we have been extremely excited to reach. Future Meat Technologies is a company that has, we have close to 30 engineers and biologists and chemists and food technologists, in addition to everybody else doing marketing and finance, right? That it was just exciting to see, 3.5 years of work culminate in this beautiful stainless steel room that can make a cow in a single day. And this is really in my mind, a landslide moment. Once you can make this at scale, exactly like Maarten said, then the sky's the limit. We will have a technology to transform the world. And the next challenge is Capex, investment.
So your new facility can produce a cow's worth of meat a day?
Yeah, so the technology that we developed involves not only the immortalization of the lines, but also media rejuvenation. Essentially, what limits growth in bioreactors is that the cells produce ammonia and lactate. Essentially, the cells are growing in their own urine. And in the body, it doesn't happen. So the chicken or the cow or the pig would have a liver that would actively remove those toxins. So we developed an artificial system to actively remove that, allowing us to reach cell densities of about 100 billion cells per liter. So this is 10 times more than the industry standard. And at these densities, you can really produce a cow a day from 1,000 liters at peak capacity. It takes about several weeks to reach that density, but it's extremely exciting.
Rahul, from you're working at a large meat company, traditional meat company, and it sounds like the supply chain and the supporting infrastructure for cultivated meat, it's going to be quite different and could be quite a distributed in terms of the supply chain versus a more centralized model for a lot of meat production in the world. Where does Tyson sit with that, and how do you see cultivated meat really scaling to compete with traditional meat?
Yeah, no. So firstly, this is, I can't imagine a more exciting time for, our industry, right? To have, new technologies and potentially premium products out there, right? So it's an exciting time. In terms of the supply chain, right? There is I break down the supply chain as the sexy part and some of the boring stuff, right? The sexy stuff is what, Kobe and Maarten and their teams are doing, right? Just sort of you take it from, the biopsy, the optimizing the media, the feeding, and you grow this, the biomass, like the product that comes out. But then you have a lot of the boring blocking and tackling that goes from taking that product to the table, right? So the question is, does it have to go to a restaurant? Does it have to go to retail? Is it direct to consumer? We have to solve issues like shelf life extension, packaging, marketing. all those things Tyson knows how to do. We do that at scale, right? So the way we look at it is our place in this ecosystem would be with the really successful sort of cultivated startups, right? In that phase where they go from the cool to the boring stuff. It's like that's where we sort of play a big role, and we bring a lot of that know-how to any sort of product that goes to market. I mean, we are 140,000, 139,000 team member employee base. We have a huge team of food experts, like PhDs of just testing food, and we do that with all our large customers, our food service customers, our retail customers. There's a lot of science that goes into it, right? So we bring that aspect, I would call it sort of the back end blocking and tackling part of the supply chain to bring this product to market.
There's something, Louisa, there's something to be said here about Tyson New Ventures engagement in this entire field from the onset. Tyson is really been leading innovation, and both and beyond, initially in the early days, and then in Memphis and in Future Meat Technologies and in other companies. And it's amazing to see that this critical innovation in industry is coming from within industry. And it's very, very exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, on that, Rahul, where do you sit with plant-based meats? As Yaakov said, you're an early investor in Beyond Meat, but do you agree that plant-based doesn't go far enough? Or do you think, in terms of market share, where do you think the two how will they compete?
Yeah, I think Kobe said it best, right? There are factors missing today from plant-based, right? And when I look at it at a very, very simple level, customers care about two things, right? Price and taste. But then that's a necessary condition. And then you have other conditions you add on top of it, in terms of health and the clean label. And there are aspects of the products we have today in the plant space that are lacking, right? And cost is one of them, but you also have, they're not the cleanest label. And I'm sure Kobe can expand on that. The products that we think are going to come out in the near term in the space is going to require is going to need some of the really amazing aspects of cultivated meat with potentially some of the aspects of plant-based. That's probably going to be what those products are going to look like. And they are going to potentially disrupt what we have today in the plant-based. And then over time, you kind of expand and you kind of grow as you get scale. And there's a lot of Capex required. But yeah, I mean, I've eaten plant-based. I think the taste is great, but there is components in there that are not optimal.
Maarten, just coming back to you, because I don't want to quite stop talking about this supply chain and scale-up challenge. How are you planning to build out your supply chains, and what sort of construction plans do you have in terms of facilities for production?
Sorry, the line momentarily froze, but I think your question was what our plans are to scale up our production facility, if I'm not mistaken,
yeah, exactly.
Louisa? Sorry about
that. And that's okay. And what is your strategy for building facilities?
Yeah, so we're currently we are in the middle of scaling towards really bigger sized industrial production lines. We've just opened our pilot plant here in the Netherlands, where we are at pre-industrial levels. After that, it's about developing that first industrial production line, really showing that this is achievable at large scale. That is our first major milestone. Hopefully it will coincide roughly with regulatory approval and we can start selling our product. After that, we really want to multiply that production line in a way that we can deliver or manufacture factories. We'll start probably in the Netherlands or in Europe and or the countries where we receive regulatory approval first. And then afterwards, our ambitions are big and we want to partner with the existing supply chain. I think what Yaakov and Rahul were talking about and their relationship, I think it's fantastic. I think it's great that the existing industry is embracing this type of technology. We have the same experience with some of our shareholders, which have an amazing position to basically do the boring stuff, as Rahul said. But for me, it's there's a lot of excitement there as well in the marketing part, delivering these products to actual consumers and positioning our brand. I think that's extremely exciting as well. But that is, we want to partner with the existing supply chain or a value chain. I think there's a lot of benefits in that. So that's how we envision the future rollout. But our big challenges are in the nearer future. I think once we reach that scale and that stage, it's about what was mentioned, a lot of Capex. We need to build factories and all over the world in order to really make impact.
Are there any other food sectors that you can kind of compare that infrastructure and supply chain to? I know people have often talked about the facilities being like breweries, for instance, for beer. Is there any kind of blueprint that you can kind of borrow from other parts of the food space? Yaakov, you're shaking your head. Is that a stupid thing to say?
No, it's not. It's I use this line all the time because people are not scared of where their beer is coming from. They're also not scared where the yogurt is coming from. It's coming from stainless steel fermenters, the same as your wine. So why shouldn't your beef or your chicken come from the same vessel? But the big challenge is to understand how much of the planet are we using for meat. If you take a look at the map of the United States, you'll see that 30% of the land mass is for pasture and grazing. Even if our technology is 100 times less demanding of space, 100 times more effective, you would still need 0.3% of the planet to be filled with factories for cultured meat. We're talking about planetary scale rollout. It's not even national scale. We're not talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars. If we do want to replace 60% of the protein demand on the market, because it's going to grow by at least 50%, the demand. If you want to do that, then we'll need to invest close to $500 billion. And we will need to do it on massive areas on the planet. It will need to happen in South America, in Africa, in China, and Europe, and the United States. It will need to happen everywhere. The only thing that we ever spread like this was the Model T car. That's it, nothing else.
You've all talked a bit about Capex being, a potential challenge, but I mean, funding into this space, has been huge. Just last week, I think it was, Aleph Farms raised over $100 million. But obviously that Capex is going to come from somewhere else other than venture capital firms. But how do you feel? I mean, have you already started to have those conversations with banks and different financing routes for that? Where will that Capex come from? Maarten?
Yeah, I think in general there's already a lot of interest coming from all sorts of different directions. There's strategic investors, people that play a role in the current food system that see the necessity to change because with the current food system we won't be able to supply the future demand anyhow. So we need to change, and a lot of people realize that. So it's often that Capex coming from those type of partners is also seen in perspective of the Capex that is required to keep their existing infrastructure alive, and that is also a huge number. So it makes the number that Yaakov mentioned, which is of course the number that is, let's say that's the number that is required. It puts it in a slightly different perspective and makes our proposition as an industry even more attractive. I think everyone is seeing the necessity to change. Everyone sees the potential this technology has. So people are basically ringing our doorbell on a very frequent basis to talk about this. I think it's fair to say that we need to prove with the first major factories that this is really something we can do at scale. And once that has been proven, I think the doorbell will be more occupied even more, because it just makes so much sense, this technology.
Great. Okay, so we have a question that's come in from the audience, and just a reminder to other people, please do submit them. So Jianing Liu asks, philosophically, animals optimize their nutrients synthesization process over thousands of years. Can man-made processes ever be more efficient, especially considering the R&D and organizational costs on top of the process cost itself?
So we're already there in many ways. The protein conversion rate right now for our cells is 1 to 1.6. That means for every kilogram of amino acids, protein that we're introducing to the system, we're getting about 800 grams of protein. It's very, very different from animals right now, which are closer to, on average, 1 to 5 ratio. So it's already better. And the way to do that is by building your biochemistry department and understanding exactly what your cells need and just giving it to them. Keep in mind that animals need to build a lot of different tissues. So when I'm eating a sandwich, that sandwich is providing nutrients for my brain, central nervous system, skin, hair, liver, gut. Even the microbiome needs to eat from the same sandwich. While the only thing interesting for me is to provide the nutrients for the muscle, because that's the need. So I can be a lot more efficient than an entire organism simply by, only growing what I want to eat at the end.
Yeah, well stated. And I think, an animal has gone through millions of years of evolution, but not to end up on our plates. They've gone through this to become better animals, and not necessarily a steak or a hamburger. That's a different goal, I would say.
Okay, the questions are coming in thick and fast now, and they're really great. One is around consumer education. We slightly touched on this, and there was a panel, I believe, yesterday that talked about the importance of consumer perception limiting the take-up of genetically modified food. How do you think cultivated meat from a steel tank becomes something people are comfortable with? This consumer acceptance, obviously on a moral standpoint, there is a big argument for reducing meat consumption. A lot of consumers are reducing their meat consumption, but how do you get them comfortable with what many of them still call lab-grown meat? And how are you investing in that as companies?
Yeah, first of all, the term lab-grown meat is not an accurate one. Yes, it started off in a lab at a certain moment in time, but now it's not produced in a lab anymore. So we need to get rid of that term, and what the perfect term should be, that's a good question. We use cell cultivated meat. Cultured meat is also used a lot. That's closer to it, I would say. Yes, we do still need to educate people, but I do also think that, for instance, the increase in popularity of plant-based products and even the pandemic has raised the awareness amongst end users that our food system needs to change, and there are consequences to the choices that people make when it comes to what they put on their plate. And I think that is helping us. That's giving us some tailwinds, and that's making the consumers receptive for what our products are. I think there's already a substantial group, that's what our consumer research is showing, that is extremely receptive to cultured meat. I think the big mass in the middle is longing for more information. I think therefore we need to be very transparent in what we're doing. That's also what we at Mosa Meat aim to do. And I think those are a couple of the principles that will help us there. But it's definitely something that will keep on deserving our attention.
Great. Okay, next question for you, Yaakov. Is it not true that cancerous cells, white blood cells, are also immortal? is this not risky to have an immortal cell growth process?
So cancer is a physiological process. It's a disease that is caused by cells breaking tissue boundaries, evading the immune system, proliferating, and more than that, actually creating metastasis. So essentially going into the bloodstream and engrafting something else with specific homing pathways engaged. It's a complete physiology, and none of it exists in what we do. The process of spontaneous immortalization has been described by Professor Hayflick back in the 1960s. It's a very straightforward process. And when you look at the genetic signatures, and we did both the complete RNA and DNA genetic signatures and compared it to every single known type of human cancer, you see that there is actually no overlap between cancerous processes to immortalization processes. And it makes sense. At the end of the day, our cells didn't need to evade the immune system. They don't need to create metastases. They don't need to break tissue boundaries. They just need to grow and be tasty. So we don't think that there is any risk associated with that. If you add to the fact that the tissue is essentially dead at the end of the process, and you cook it and then you eat it and it's digested and broken down, there is really no risk being associated with it. And we think that multiple regulatory agencies are agreeing with us. The only risk that we can envision is one where genetic modification would alter some proteins that would initiate an immune response, for example, or that processes would be as such that any type of genes which jump to another tissue. But because we're not doing any genetic modification, we don't think that risk applies to us. But it might apply to other technologies. This needs to be explored closely.
Maarten, are you using genetic modification and have
Nope.
any response to that?
No, I think for the reasons that were mentioned, I think on top of that, from a scientific point of view, there are, maybe scenarios that you can think about that pose a risk. I think they're very, very minimal, as Yaakov has mentioned. We don't use any genetic modification because we don't have to, basically. We're able to do it without any genetic modification. And for us, the main reason also to stay away from it is that in significant parts of the world, Europe and China, I think are two examples, consumers have kind of a lower acceptance of foods with genetic modification or any ingredient which has been modified. Regulatory approval processes, for instance, in Europe are also more cumbersome if you have any genetic modification or GMO in your process. So those are some of the reasons why we don't have any genetic modification in our process or in our product.
Another question. Some studies suggest that if you do a complete life cycle analysis, the benefits may not exist for energy. Have you analyzed this? I know there's been some research around the carbon footprint of cultivated meat. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah.
Go ahead. No, Maarten, go ahead.
No, sorry, I took the previous question. Go ahead. I'm happy to answer this one too, but
let's both do it.
Okay, great. Well, then I'll go first if we both stay silent. Now, this is, of course, a very important question. At the core of why we are doing this is that we want to make the mission is to make a positive impact on climate change. And if we are going to consume a lot more energy while doing so, you can debate if we're doing the right thing. A lot of the things, the impact like greenhouse gas emissions, land usage, water, that's all clear. All the studies show that this is going to make a huge difference. And we're talking about 90, 95, 90, even higher percentages that we will do better. A question is, when it comes to energy, is really what is the technology that's being used, and a lot of the companies will use different technologies, and therefore it's pretty unclear what cultured meat as a group will be from energy consumption point of view, and also what your reference is. We try to contribute to as many studies as possible. We've done our studies ourselves. A recent study performed by CE Delft shows that, especially for beef, cultured meat will do tremendous amounts or a tremendous high percentages better than conventional beef when it also comes to energy. It's not going to be in the 90+ range. They've indicated 40 to 60%. They've used the envisioned production methodology that we will be using. But, you know, being it so much at the core of what we believe in, we also think that the energy that we will be using should be, renewable energy. So we're fitting our pilot plant with solar panels. We're sourcing our energy as sustainably as possible. Really, and I think this is going to be part of our rollout in the future as well. Really trying to minimize the energy consumption as well, next to the reduction in other resources that we will be achieving.
Yaakov, if you don't mind, I'll go on to another question since there are a few of them.
Just let me say one thing about this. Look, if animals are growing on marginal lands on the rolling hills of the Swiss Alps, then we're probably going to be the same, you know. But regretfully, we don't have 8 million people on this planet. We have 8 billion people on this planet. So if we're talking about feedlots, there is simply no comparison. It's an order of magnitude more efficient.
Okay, it's interesting. There's two questions that are relatively similar, talking about where cultivated meat can be grown. Could you envisage a future where communities and individuals can grow their own cultivated meat? And another question is, do you think that it could solve the problem of food imports and replace them with local production in countries where meat production, where growing animals is more tricky, like such as places in the Middle East? So where do you think that meat, cultivated meat production how individual could it get, how local could it get?
Right. So let me try to answer this question with an example. Right now, I'm sitting on the 5th floor of a commercial building. 5 floors below me, there is a pet store, a large supermarket, and a hamburger joint. In one small room here, we have a 1,000-liter facility that is making, just like I said before, a cow a day. So extremely local. You can essentially envision building one of these factories above Whole Foods to supply for that supermarket exclusively. I don't think it makes a lot of sense to do it in individual homes, like some have proposed. But I think for supermarkets, it makes perfect sense, especially for large chains. To me, this was critical. Future Meat Technologies is based on distributive manufacturing. And the reason that we were focused on that is because if you look at the demand over the next 2 decades, most of the demand is coming from massive urbanization in China, India, and then if you look closely, South America and Africa too. So it's critical to allow countries that don't have a lot of land resources, water resources, to grow their own meat. And we're specifically looking into China and into India and into other countries. And we think it's important. We think it's critical.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think this goes back to the question at the beginning of this, right? It's about the technology, right? And it's where, going back to the consumer cares about price and taste, right? Think about price. You have to ask what kind of technologies are more distributed versus what kind of technology require that huge scale to bring down the cost, right? So I think one of the exciting things about what Kobe and Future Meat is doing is basically solving the engineering problem where you can actually have a distributed model, right? So when you have a distributed model, it literally answers the question you asked. It says, can this be local And the question is, what's the asymptote of local, right? Is local meaning a family or local meaning a village? And also local within a landlocked, nation, a local versus could mean like, do you need a global supply chain versus a local supply chain? So it really comes back to what's needed for that technology to sort of get to that, to that price where you can have consumers actually afford it.
Great. Okay, quickly, one more question. Does cultured meat meet kosher halal requirements? And if not, have you considered religious cultural requirements?
Well, obviously we did, right? So there are religious laws about kosher and halal, and there are two major ones. The first one is that according to both religions, both Jewish and Islamic, you are not supposed to eat a piece of an animal while the animal is alive. So any technology that will take, for example, a sample from an animal and keep that animal alive, grow that sample to eat, is going to have significant religious significations across the world. So for us, we made sure that we are taking samples from animals that have been slaughtered in a kosher and halal way. Because we need to take that sample only once, it didn't affect our process. We're taking it from the discarded skin of the animal, and then that is the sample that we're growing. So based on the religious information that we have, and based on the approvals with the rabbis and the imams that we have spoke with, we think that our product is going to be both kosher and halal, and therefore, we're very excited about it.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, we're out of time. Thank you both so much. And thanks to everyone for submitting questions. And thanks again to Pinduoduo for having us.